In the forgotten hollows of the Appalachian spine, where the fog clings to the hills like a shroud and the trees whisper secrets older than any map, some stories are best left to rot with the fallen leaves. They are tales told in hushed tones around dying embers, legends of families whose roots run so deep into the dark mountain soil that they have become something other than human. Such was the story of Jedediah Cain and his children. They did not call it a story, not aloud. They called it a caution. A shadow that fell across the valley, a reason to bar the door and speak no name into the night. The year was 1895 when Dr. Alastair Finch first heard the name, and he, being a man of science and reason, dismissed it as the lurid folklore of an isolated and uneducated people. He had come to the jagged peaks of West Virginia on a fool's errand of benevolence, a commission from the State Board of Health to survey the outlying communities, to document the ailments of body and mind that festered in such profound seclusion. He was young, armed with a medical bag and a firm belief that light and knowledge could disinfect any darkness. He would soon learn that some darkness does not flee from the light, but rather, consumes it. His journey had taken him from one grim, tight-lipped settlement to another, but none possessed the oppressive atmosphere of the valley that cupped Cain's Hollow in its stony palm. The air itself felt heavy, weighted with an unspoken dread. The people moved with a furtive quickness, their eyes darting away from his, their shoulders hunched as if against a perpetual storm. When he asked for directions to the Cain homestead, the most remote property on his survey list, the friendly proprietor of the dusty general store suddenly found a barrel of nails that required his immediate and undivided attention. A simple question, met with a wall of silence so thick Finch could almost feel it pressing against his chest. He was told only that the path was treacherous and that Jedediah Cain was a man who valued his privacy above all else. It was later, in the failing light of his first day, that he overheard the whispers. Two old men, thinking him out of earshot, spoke in low, fearful murmurs. One mentioned a traveler, a peddler who had taken the wrong path up to Cain's land 2 seasons prior and had simply vanished. The other spat into the dirt and muttered a phrase that would etch itself into Finch's mind. He spoke of the mountain father's secret, of the 2 towering shadows that moved behind the trees on the high ridge. He spoke of Jedediah's twins. He did not describe them with the fondness of a neighbor speaking of children. He spoke of them as one might speak of a blight, a curse upon the land. They were, he'd whispered, unnatural. Giants. And the way he said it carried a terror that went far beyond mere physical size. It was a terror of what they were for. Finch, a man accustomed to the precise language of anatomy and diagnosis, found himself unsettled. The word giant was a clinical term, a matter of pituitary glands and growth hormones. But here, in this suffocating hollow, it felt like a word from a darker, older book. This was not the beginning of a medical survey. It was the chilling prologue to a story he felt he was already a part of, a story whose ending was already written in the fearful eyes of every person he met. The mountain loomed over him, and for the first time, Alastair Finch felt the profound and unnerving sensation that it was watching him back. Dr. Finch was not a man easily deterred. His education in the lecture halls of Boston had instilled in him a resolve that bordered on obstinacy. The community's silence was not merely a challenge, it was a symptom, a malady of the collective spirit that he felt compelled to diagnose. He began his work in the lower valley, treating croup and setting the broken bones of taciturn farmers, all the while gently probing for information. He would ask about the health of the children in the hollow, about any congenital afflictions or unusual patterns of growth. His inquiries were always met with the same impenetrable defense, a folksy platitude, a sudden recollection of an urgent chore, or a cold, dismissive stare that advised him to mind the business of his medical bag and nothing more. The spiritual heart of the community, a small, whitewashed church with a leaning steeple, offered no solace. He sought out the local preacher, a man named Reverend Micah, whose gaunt frame and feverish eyes spoke of a piety that was more fire and brimstone than Christian charity. Finch found him polishing the worn pine pulpit, a task he performed with a meticulous, almost frantic energy. Finch introduced himself and explained his mission, framing his questions about the Cain family in the context of public health. Reverend Micah stopped his polishing, his knuckles white on the rag. He turned to face Finch, and a thin, unsettling smile stretched his lips. "The Lord's flock has many shepherds, Doctor," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "Jedediah Cain is a shepherd of his own hill. He is a man of profound faith, a testament to the strength that can be found in righteous isolation." Finch pressed, mentioning the importance of reaching every family, no matter how remote. "There are some," the preacher continued, his smile never wavering, "who have made their own covenant with God and with this land. Their ways are not our ways, but they are righteous in the eyes of the Almighty. A wise man does not seek to understand that which is not meant for him. He accepts the Lord's mysteries and tends to his own garden." The words were coded in Scripture, but the message beneath was as sharp and cold as a knife. It was a threat elegantly delivered. "Leave it alone." As Finch left the church, the preacher's parting words followed him out into the gray afternoon. "The mountain has its own laws, Doctor. Older than any book you carry." The weight of this conspiracy of silence was suffocating. It was in the way the children would stop their play and stare as he passed. It was in the way conversations would cease in the general store the moment he stepped through the door. This was not simple privacy, it was a pact, a shared and terrible knowledge that bound them all in a fellowship of fear. The Cains were not just a family, they were a taboo. The twins were not just children, they were a monster that the entire village had conspired to keep hidden. Finch began to understand that the ailment he had been sent to study was not of the body, but of the soul. The hollow was sick, poisoned by a secret it was forced to carry, and the infection ran deepest at the top of the mountain, in the house of Jedediah Cain. The doctor's obstinacy was now alloyed with a grim sense of duty. He was no longer just a physician. He was an investigator, standing at the edge of a darkness that an entire community was desperate to pretend did not exist. He knew then that he would have to ascend the mountain. He had to see for himself. The path to the Cain homestead was more of a suggestion than a trail, a faint scar of packed earth that wound its way through a dense and ancient forest. The trees grew unnaturally close, their branches interlocking overhead to form a canopy that starved the forest floor of light. A thick, wet fog rolled down the mountainside, muffling sound and reducing visibility to a few spectral feet. It was a landscape designed for secrets. Twice, Finch lost the path completely, forced to backtrack through the sucking mud and tangled undergrowth, the silence of the woods pressing in on him. It was a hostile, living silence, broken only by the drip of water from unseen leaves and the frantic beating of his own heart. It was in this disorienting gray wilderness that he stumbled upon the cabin. It was little more than a hovel, slumped against the hillside as if it had grown weary and knelt down to die. A thin wisp of smoke, pale as a ghost, curled from its crumbling stone chimney. He approached with caution, his footsteps swallowed by the moss and damp earth. He was a doctor, and this was a dwelling. Duty compelled him to inquire after its occupant. The door creaked open before he could knock. A woman stood there, framed in the gloom. She was ancient, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her body as frail and bent as a winter branch. Her eyes, however, were sharp and lucid, and they fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. He introduced himself, his voice sounding loud and foolish in the oppressive quiet. She did not respond. She simply stared, her gaze seeming to pass right through him, weighing something in a balance only she could see. Finally, she spoke, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You are the doctor from the flatlands. You ask too many questions." Finch admitted that he did, explaining that it was his nature and his job. He asked if she needed any medical attention. She ignored the question. "You seek the house of Cain," she stated, not a question but a fact. "That is a fool's path. Jedediah does not welcome visitors. And what he keeps does not welcome them either." The woman's name, he would learn, was Alara. She was the sister of Jedediah's late wife, Sarah. She had lived on this small plot, on the edge of her brother-in-law's domain, for 20 years, a recluse tolerated only because of a family connection that Jedediah was too proud to sever. She was a pariah, a ghost in the Hollow's memory. She saw the resolve in Finch's face, the stubborn set of his jaw that would not be dissuaded by folksy threats. A flicker of something, despair, or perhaps a desperate, long-buried hope, crossed her features. She shuffled back into the darkness of her cabin and returned a moment later. She pressed a small object into his hand. It was a wooden bird, crudely carved from a piece of pine, its surface worn smooth with time. "Sarah made this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "My sister. Before she was taken by the fever. She loved to carve." Jedediah called it a frivolous waste of a good woman's hands. The bird was misshapen, its wings uneven, but there was a desperate quality to it, an energy trapped in the wood. "Why are you giving this to me?" Finch asked, his fingers closing around the object. Elara looked up toward the fog-shrouded peak where the cane house stood. "Because you have a good face. And because you will not listen to warnings. If you must walk into the spider's web, you should at least carry a stone to break the thread." Sarah, she was cleverer than Jedediah ever knew. He saw only a meek wife. "I saw a prisoner. And prisoners are always looking for a key." With that, she retreated into her hovel and closed the door, leaving Finch alone in the fog with the cryptic gift and the chilling implication that Sarah Kane's death might not have been a simple tragedy of mountain life. The wooden bird felt heavy in his hand, impossibly heavy, as if it were weighted with the full story of this sorrowful place. Back in the small, musty room he had rented above the general store, Alastair Finch examined the wooden bird under the flickering light of an oil lamp. It was, as Elara had said, a crude thing. The knifework was hesitant, the form imperfect. It looked like the work of a child, or of someone whose hands were unaccustomed to such delicate tasks. Yet, as he turned it over and over, his clinical eye for detail noticed something the casual observer would miss. Along the bird's back, hidden within the rough gouges meant to simulate feathers, was a seam so fine it was nearly invisible. It was not a crack in the wood. It was a deliberate, masterful join. His heart quickened. This was not a simple carving. It was a container. It was a puzzle box, fashioned to look like a trifle. His fingers, trained for the delicate work of surgery, probed the seam, searching for a purchase. For nearly an hour he worked, his frustration mounting. The box was sealed tight, either by time or by design. He was about to set it aside when his thumb pressed a particular spot at the base of the bird's tail. He felt a faint click, a minute shift in the internal mechanism. The seam along the back widened by a hair's breadth. With painstaking care, he inserted the fine blade of his pocketknife into the gap and gently twisted. The top half of the bird came away, revealing a small, hollowed-out cavity. It was an ingenious piece of work, a secret hidden in plain sight. Inside, there was no letter, no desperate, scrawled confession. There was only a single, tiny piece of paper, folded into a tight, minuscule square. Finch's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The paper was brittle, yellowed with age. Drawn on it in faint, faded ink was not a message, but a map. It was a floor plan, a simple, hand-drawn layout of a cabin's main room. He could make out the shapes of a table, chairs, a large stone fireplace. It was the hearth that drew his eye. A specific flagstone on the floor directly in front of it was marked with a small, precise X. Elara's words echoed in his mind. Prisoners are always looking for a key, this was it. This was Sarah Kane's final, desperate message, sent out into the future. A map leading not to treasure, but to truth. A profound sense of gravity settled over Finch. This was no longer a matter of professional curiosity or a puzzle to be solved. This was a duty to the dead. The cryptic warnings of the preacher, the fearful silence of the townsfolk, the tragic story of a vanished peddler, and the haunted look in an old woman's eyes, it all began to coalesce around this single, stark X on a piece of hidden paper. He was the one who had found the key. Now, he had to find the lock. His resolve, which had been tempered by the community's resistance, now hardened into cold, unyielding steel. He knew what he had to do. The hollow could keep its silence. The preacher could keep his veiled threats. He was going back up that mountain. He would wait for the cover of darkness, for a storm if he was lucky, and he would enter the house of Jedediah Cain. He would stand before that hearth, and he would find what Sarah Cain had risked everything to hide. The lamp flame guttered, casting his long, determined shadow against the wall. The time for questions was over. The heavens themselves seemed to conspire to aid his dark errand. 2 nights later, a storm broke over the mountains, a furious deluge of wind and rain that rattled the windows of the general store and turned the hollow's single dirt road into a river of mud. The thunder was a drumbeat, a perfect cover for a trespasser. Dressed in dark, durable clothes, with a crowbar and his medical bag containing only the most essential tools, Finch set out into the maelstrom. The journey up the path was a brutal struggle against the elements. The wind tore at him, and the rain, cold as ice, soaked him to the bone. But the storm was his ally, its chaos a cloak. When he finally saw the faint, defiant light of a lamp in the window of the Cain homestead, he felt a surge of adrenaline that banished the cold. The house was larger than a typical mountain cabin, a testament to Jedediah's prosperity and dominance. It was built of thick, dark logs, with a sprawling porch and a great stone chimney that belched smoke into the violet sky. A large, foreboding barn stood a short distance away, its doors shut tight against the storm. Finch circled the property, keeping to the shadows at the edge of the woods. He needed a way in that was quiet and unseen. His gaze fell upon the root cellar, its slanted doors set against the foundation of the house. Such doors were often secured by a simple wooden bar on the inside. But sometimes, in a house built on arrogance, such details were overlooked. He was right. After a moment of prying with the crowbar, one of the rain-swollen doors groaned and lifted just enough for him to squeeze through. He slid down into the damp, earthy darkness of the cellar. The air was thick with the smell of potatoes and damp stone and something else, a faint, cloying, metallic scent he couldn't quite place. He lit his small storm lantern, keeping the flame low. The cellar was large and well-stocked, but his eyes were drawn to the far corner. There, bolted to the stone wall, were 2 massive iron rings, thick as a man's wrist. Heavy chains were attached, pooled on the dirt floor below. They were clean, but the wall around them was scarred and gouged. Finch stared at them, his blood running cold. What purpose could these serve in a root cellar? He forced the thought from his mind. He had one purpose. He located the wooden steps leading up into the house and ascended, his every movement a study in silence. The door at the top was unlocked. He emerged into a small pantry, the sounds of the house now audible over the storm, the crackle of a fire, the low murmur of a voice. He crept to the pantry door and peered through a crack. He was in the main room. A fire blazed in the massive stone hearth he recognized from Sarah's drawing. Seated at a large table was Jedediah Cain, reading from a heavy Bible, his voice a low, commanding drone. Finch's breath caught in his throat. He could see them. The twins. They sat on simple stools on either side of the fireplace, their backs to him. Even seated, their size was staggering. They were giants, just as the whispers had said. Their shoulders were broader than the doorway, their hands, resting on their knees, were the size of dinner plates. They were perfectly still, their attention fixed on the fire, like 2 immense, captive statues. Finch's heart hammered against his ribs. He waited, his muscles screaming with tension, for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Jedediah closed the Bible with a resounding thud. "It is time," he said. The 2 giants rose in unison, their movements slow and ponderous. They did not speak. They simply turned and exited through a back door, disappearing into the night. Jedediah remained at the table for a moment, then rose and retired to a room at the back of the house, closing the door behind him. The main room was empty. This was his chance. He slipped from the pantry, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor. He crossed to the hearth, the heat of the fire warming his chilled face. He knelt, his lantern casting a pool of light on the flagstones. He found it immediately. The X. It was almost invisible, a faint scratch mark, but it was there. Using the tip of the crowbar, he worked it into the seam. The stone was heavy. He put his shoulder into it, gritting his teeth, praying the noise would be lost in the storm. The stone lifted. Beneath it was a hollowed-out space. And in that space, wrapped in a sheath of oilcloth, was a small, leather-bound book. He had found it. Sarah Kane's journal. He did not dare read it in the house of his enemy. Clutching the oilcloth-wrapped journal to his chest, Alastair Finch retreated as silently as he had come, back through the cellar and into the raging storm. The journey back down the mountain was a blur of mud, rain, and triumphant fear. Only when he was back in the security of his rented room, the door bolted and a chair wedged beneath the handle, did he allow himself to breathe. He unwrapped the oilcloth with trembling fingers. The leather of the journal was stiff and cold, the pages within warped by years of dampness. The ink was faded, the handwriting a delicate, spidery script that spoke of a gentle hand. It was the diary of Sarah Kane. He opened to the first page and began to read, the words of a dead woman filling the silence of the small room, a voice rising from the grave. The early entries, dated nearly 2 decades prior, were filled with the hopeful innocence of a young bride. She wrote of her love for Jedediah, of his strength and his commanding presence. She described him as a man of vision, a king in his own small kingdom of woods and stone. But even in these first pages, a thread of darkness was woven into the tapestry of her affection. She wrote of his obsession, a word she used with loving concern at first. An obsession with legacy, with purity of the line, with a strange and distorted interpretation of the Old Testament. Jedediah, she wrote, believed that the men of the modern world had grown weak, soft, and corrupt. He dreamed of forging a new kind of man, a stronger breed, one fit to inherit the harsh beauty of the mountains, a race of patriarchs to rule a new Eden. Finch read on, his sense of dread growing with every turned page. The loving concern in Sarah's writing began to curdle into fear. She recounted conversations where Jedediah spoke of his own father, a man she had never met, a man spoken of in the lower hollows as a cruel and godless eccentric. Jedediah, in a rare moment of confidence, had confessed that his father had been a student of bloodlines and breeding, not just with his livestock, but with men. He had kept meticulous ledgers, attempting to divine the secrets of creating superior strength and size through selective pairings. Jedediah spoke of this not with shame, but with a chilling, proprietary pride. He saw his father not as a monster, but as a pioneer. He intended to finish the work. A cold sweat broke out on Finch's brow. He read a passage dated from the spring of 1876, Jedediah brought home a man today. A hired hand from the low country, large of frame and simple of mind. He says the man is here to help clear the new pasture. But I see the way Jedediah looks at him. Not as a man looks at a laborer, but as he looks at his prize bull before breeding season. He measures him with his eyes. He makes notes in his father's old ledger. At night, I hear him in the main room, whispering verses from Genesis, the parts about the giants who walked the earth in the old days. He calls them the Nephilim. He says it is his holy duty to bring them back. I am afraid. I am so terribly afraid. The journal detailed 2 more instances of large, solitary men being hired for work on the Kane homestead, only to vanish weeks later, their wages collected by Jedediah, who claimed they had simply moved on. Sarah knew better. She wrote of strange sounds from the barn at night, of her husband returning to the house with blood on his knuckles and a look of righteous fury in his eyes. She was a prisoner in her own home, a silent witness to a growing madness she could not comprehend. Then came the entry Finch had been dreading. The one that explained everything. I am with child, she wrote, the script shaky and blotted. Jedediah is ecstatic. He calls it the fruit of his great work. He lays his hand on my belly and speaks to it, not as a father speaks to his child, but as a craftsman speaks to his creation. He does not ask if I am well. He asks if I am carrying his legacy. He has told me what he did. What he arranged. He sees no sin in it. He calls it a holy union of strength, a necessary sacrifice for a greater purpose. The father of my child is not one man. He is a design. My God, what is growing inside of me? The narrative in the journal became a frantic, disjointed chronicle of terror. Sarah Kane's entries grew shorter, the elegant script devolving into a desperate scrawl. She described the final months of her pregnancy as a form of body horror, a feeling of being a vessel for something alien. She grew to an immense size, far beyond that of a normal pregnancy. The local midwife, a friend of her family, was turned away at the door by Jedediah, who declared that he, and he alone, would oversee the birth of his legacy. He was the only one who touched her, his clinical, appraising hands feeling for the movement of the life within her, his expression a terrifying mix of paternal pride and a scientist's detached curiosity. The birth itself was recounted in a single, harrowing entry written a week after the event, the ink smeared as if by tears or sweat. "They are born," she wrote. *2. 2 boys. Or are they boys? They are vast. Jedediah held them up to the lamplight, and he did not coo as a father would. He wept, but his tears were not of joy. They were tears of triumph. He shouted, "Behold! The strength of the mountain made flesh." Phineas and Morwen. The midwife would have called them monsters. Jedediah called them a miracle. They did not cry like other babes. They emitted a low, rumbling sound, a noise from deep within their unnaturally large chests. "I am their mother, and I am terrified of them." Finch had to put the journal down. He paced his small room, the floorboards groaning under his feet. The chain of abominations was now clear. Jedediah, in his fanatical quest, had not merely stumbled upon giants. He had engineered them. He had continued his father's monstrous experiments, using his own wife as the incubator for his grotesque vision. The hired hands were not laborers, they were breeding stock, chosen for their size and strength, and likely disposed of when their purpose was served. The twins, Phineas and Morwen, were the result. They were victims from the moment of their conception. The journal resumed, detailing the first few years of the twins' lives. It was a portrait of a childhood that was anything but. They were raised not as sons, but as specimens. Jedediah kept them in near total isolation, forbidding anyone from the hollow from seeing them. He controlled their diet, a strange concoction of raw milk, blood, and ground bone meal, convinced it would foster their prodigious growth. And grow they did. By the age of 5, they were the size of 10-year-old boys. By 10, they towered over their own mother. By 15, they were the behemoths Finch had seen by the fire. Their education was not in letters or numbers, but in strength and obedience. Jedediah subjected them to a brutal regimen of physical labor, forcing them to haul logs and lift stones that would challenge a team of oxen. He taught them nothing of the outside world, nothing of kindness or empathy. Their world was the cabin, the barn, the woods, and the unshakable, terrifying authority of their father. Sarah wrote of her attempts to break through, to teach them a simple song, to show them a moment of maternal tenderness. These attempts were always met with Jedediah's wrath. He accused her of trying to soften them, to pollute the purity of his creation. She described the look in her son's eyes, a dull, vacant confusion. They were incapable of processing affection. The only emotion they understood was fear of their father. "They are growing stronger every day," one entry read. And I see a new light in Jedediah's eyes. A look of purpose. He has forged his weapons. Now, I fear, he is ready to use them. The community, meanwhile, was kept in line through a combination of economic dependency and sheer terror. Jedediah owned the land most of them sharecropped. He controlled the flow of goods through the hollow. The whispers of his giant sons were all the enforcement he needed. No one dared to cross him. They turned a blind eye, becoming complicit in his madness through their silence. Sarah Kane was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The final section of the journal was where the true horror, the ultimate purpose of Jedediah's monstrous project, was laid bare. The entries were dated in the last year of Sarah's life, her despair a palpable thing on the page. The twins had reached their full, colossal stature. They were men in body, but children in mind, their psychological development arrested by their cruel upbringing. They were little more than living tools, extensions of their father's will. And Jedediah had found a use for them. The first incident Sarah recorded involved a dispute over a property line with a neighboring farmer. The man, a stubborn old farmer named Silas Blackwood, had refused to yield a small, fallow field that Jedediah coveted. Threats had been exchanged. One night, Jedediah took the twins, now nearly 7 feet tall and possessed of terrifying strength, and went to the Blackwood farm. Sarah's entry from the next morning was a single, trembling paragraph. Silas Blackwood has gone. His wife says he went out to check the fences last night and never returned. His lantern was found smashed in the disputed field. Jedediah said nothing at breakfast. He simply looked at his sons, who sat staring at their plates, their knuckles raw and bruised. He placed a hand on each of their shoulders, and he smiled. It was the smile of a man admiring his handiwork. He has turned my boys into his enforcers. His cudgel Finch felt a wave of nausea. This was the secret. This was the terror that kept the Hollow in its silent thrall. The twins were not just a hidden oddity, they were the instrument of Jedediah's tyranny. They were his secret police, his executioners. The story of the vanished peddler from 2 seasons prior now made a chilling, sickening sense. He hadn't just gotten lost. He had seen something he shouldn't have, or perhaps he had simply been a target of opportunity for Jedediah to test the obedience of his creations. What had they done to him? What had they done to Silas Blackwood? The journal did not provide grisly details. It did not need to. The implication was far more terrifying. Jedediah had bred his own monsters, and now he was loosing them upon the world. The diary grew more desperate. Sarah wrote of hearing screams from the direction of the barn late at night. She wrote of Jedediah forbidding her from ever entering it. She knew, with a mother's horrifying certainty, that the barn was where the final acts of her husband's brutal justice were carried out. The iron rings and chains Finch had seen in the cellar took on a new, unspeakable significance. Were they for punishment? Or were they for holding Jedediah's victims before they were brought before the terrible judgment of his sons? I tried to speak to them, Sarah wrote. To Phineas. I found him alone, mending a fence. I asked him if he remembered the song I used to sing him, the one about the little bird. For a moment, a flicker of something crossed his face. A memory. Confusion. Then he looked toward the house, toward his father's window, and the light in his eyes went out. He turned his back to me and did not speak. He is lost. They are both lost. Jedediah has hollowed them out and filled them with his own darkness. There is nothing of me left in them. Nothing but the shell. The very last entry was written in a frantic, barely legible hand. It was clear she wrote it in extreme haste and terror. He knows I have been writing. He found my ink pot hidden away. His eyes when he looked at me, it was not anger. It was disappointment. The look of a man who has found a flaw in his prized mare. He said my sentimentality was a sickness that could not be cured. He said he would not allow it to infect his legacy. He is planning something. I know it. I have hidden this book. I have given the key to Alara. Perhaps one day a good man will come. A man of reason. Someone who will not be cowed by the silence. If you are reading this, do not mourn for me. My fate was sealed the day I married him. Avenge my sons. They were never given a choice. They are the greatest victims of all. Avenge them. Below the last line, a single, dark blot of ink had fallen, like a black tear. 3 days after that final entry, according to the Hollow's memory, Sarah Kane had slipped and fallen from the hayloft of the barn, breaking her neck. It was ruled a tragic accident. Finch closed the journal, his hands shaking with a mixture of grief and pure, cold rage. The truth was worse than any folklore. It was a systematic, multi-generational atrocity, hidden beneath a veneer of piety and patriarchal rule. He was the good man Sarah had hoped for. The question now, the one that pounded in his skull, was what would he do with this terrible knowledge? Alastair Finch sat in the darkness of his room, the journal a leaden weight on the table before him. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and a silence that felt heavier than the thunder. The path forward was a treacherous fog, as bewildering as the mountain trails. Who could he go to? The local sheriff, a portly, complacent man named Bartlett, was a known beneficiary of Jedediah's patronage. He would laugh Finch out of his office or, worse, send a rider to warn Kane that his secrets were uncovered. The state authorities in Charleston were a week's ride away, and what proof did he have? The word of a dead woman in a diary he had obtained by breaking and entering. They would see him as a hysterical city doctor, meddling in the affairs of the mountain folk, his accusations wild and unsubstantiated. No, the law of the flatlands had no jurisdiction here. As the preacher had said, the mountain had its own laws. And Finch now understood that the only justice that could be found for Sarah and her monstrously abused sons would have to be meted out by that same law. A cold, hard resolve settled in his heart, displacing the physician's oath to do no harm. Some diseases could not be cured with medicine. They had to be cut out. He was filled with a righteous indignation, a fury on behalf of the woman who had died in despair and the two living monsters who had never been allowed to be men. He would not be their avenger. He could not. But he could be the catalyst. He could be the stone that breaks the thread, just as Alara had said. He had to confront Jedediah. He had to face the architect of this horror himself, armed not with a weapon, but with the truth. It was a suicidal thought. What could one man do against a patriarch who commanded giants? But the alternative, to flee, to leave the secret buried and the cycle of violence to continue, was unthinkable. It would be a betrayal of Sarah's last hope, a betrayal of his own conscience. The next morning, under a sky of bruised purple and gray, Finch walked out of the general store. He did not take the hidden path through the woods. He walked up the main road, in full view of the Hollow's watchful eyes. He wanted them to see him. He wanted them to know that the silence was about to be broken. He carried no weapon, only his medical bag. And in his pocket, his fingers wrapped tightly around the small, crudely carved wooden bird. The walk to the Kane homestead was different in the daylight. The woods were no less foreboding, the house no less intimidating. As he approached the clearing, he saw them. The twins. They were splitting logs near the barn, their movements synchronized and powerful. Each swing of their massive axes cleft a thick log in two. They were a terrifying spectacle of raw, brutal strength. They stopped their work as he emerged from the trees, their heads turning in unison, their faces blank, incurious slates. They watched him approach the house, their stillness more menacing than any threat. Finch's heart pounded, but he did not slow his pace. He walked onto the porch and called out the name, his voice ringing with a clarity that surprised him. Jedediah Kane. The front door opened, and the patriarch emerged. He was a striking figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a great white beard that flowed down his chest and eyes as clear and cold as mountain spring water. He looked like a prophet from his own Bible. He showed no surprise at seeing Finch, only a mild, patronizing curiosity. "Dr. Finch," he said, his voice a calm, deep baritone. "You are a persistent man. I had thought the Reverend Micah had made the customs of this hollow clear to you." "Your customs are murder and abomination, cloaked in scripture," Finch said, his own voice steady, fueled by the rage that had been simmering within him. A flicker of annoyance crossed Kane's face, but it was quickly replaced by his serene, arrogant mask. "You speak with the arrogance of the ignorant. You see with mortal eyes. I do the Lord's work. I am restoring the strength that has been bled out of mankind by your soft, decadent world. You call this strength? Finch retorted, gesturing toward the silent, watching twins. You have created slaves. You have taken your own sons and twisted them into mindless beasts to do your bidding. You murdered your wife when she saw the truth of what you are. For the first time, Cain's composure cracked. A flash of genuine fury lit his eyes. You will not speak her name. She was weak. Her sentimentality was a flaw in the bloodline. A flaw I corrected. It was a confession, delivered with the chilling conviction of a man who believed his own lies. And now, Cain continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl, you have become a flaw. A loose thread in the tapestry. One that must be snipped. He turned his head slightly and called to his sons, his voice once again the calm, unbreakable voice of command. Phineas. Morwen. The good doctor has trespassed. He has spoken blasphemy. Bring him to the barn. He requires correction. The two giants turned from their woodpile and began to walk toward the porch. Their advance was slow, deliberate, and utterly terrifying. They moved with the inexorable force of a landslide, their huge frames blocking out the gray morning light, their shadows falling over Finch like the doors of a tomb. Finch stood his ground, his hand tightening on the wooden bird in his pocket. He was not a fool. He knew he could not fight them. He could not outrun them. His only weapon was the one Sarah Cain had left him, a memory. As Phineas, the larger of the two, reached the porch steps, his immense hand reaching for him, Finch pulled the bird from his pocket. He did not brandish it at Jedediah. He held it out in the palm of his hand, toward the twins. Your mother made this, he said, his voice clear and resonant, cutting through the tension. Sarah. Her name was Sarah. She sang you a song when you were small, about a bird just like this. Do you remember? The twins stopped. Their forward momentum ceased so abruptly it was as if they had run into an invisible wall. Their blank, brutalized faces, which had shown no emotion, now registered a profound and startling confusion. Their eyes, which had been dull and vacant, now held a flicker of something ancient and long suppressed. Phineas's outstretched hand trembled and fell to his side. Morwen let out a low, guttural sound, a noise of pain and bewilderment. Jedediah saw the shift, the momentary break in his absolute control. A look of pure fury contorted his face. Fools! He is poisoning you with her weakness. Seize him now, he roared, his voice cracking with a frantic edge. But his command, for the first time in their lives, did not register. Their attention was fixed on the small wooden bird, a tiny, tangible link to a past they had been forced to forget, to the only source of tenderness they had ever known. Finch pressed his advantage, speaking not to the giants, but to the lost children within. She loved you, he said, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't expected. She knew what he was turning you into. She died trying to save you. It was that last word, save, that broke the dam. A lifetime of abuse, of conditioned obedience and repressed rage, shattered in an instant. Phineas turned his head, very slowly, and looked at his father. For the first time, it was not the look of a slave at his master. It was the look of a creature that has finally identified the source of its pain. No! Jedediah screamed, seeing the change, seeing his creations, his legacy, slipping from his grasp. He lunged forward, perhaps to strike Finch, perhaps to reassert his authority over his sons. It was his final, fatal mistake. Morwen, the quieter of the two, moved with a speed that was shocking for his size. He grabbed his father's arm, his massive fingers closing around it like a vice. There was a sickening crack of bone. Jedediah shrieked, a sound of agony and disbelief. Phineas, his face a mask of dawning, terrible comprehension, took a step toward his father. The ensuing moments were a blur of horrific, primal violence. It was not a fight. It was a reckoning. The rage that Jedediah had so carefully cultivated and directed outward had finally turned back on its creator. It was the rage of Silas Blackwood, of the vanished peddler, of a broken-hearted mother, and of 2 stolen childhoods. It was swift, brutal, and absolute. Alastair Finch did not stay to watch. He backed away, turned, and walked away from the House of Cain, the sounds of the final, terrible act of justice fading behind him. He did not look back. He left the hollow that day, the wooden bird still clutched in his hand. He filed a report with the state, a heavily redacted version of the truth, stating that Jedediah Cain and his 2 sons, all suffering from an unrecorded malady of the mind, had perished in a violent domestic dispute. The case was closed. The hollow guarded its new secret with an even deeper silence. No one ever went up the mountain again. The twins were never seen, but some nights, travelers on the far ridge would report hearing a long, mournful cry echoing through the valleys, a sound that was not quite human, a lament for a life that was never lived, a freedom that came at an unspeakable cost. Justice had been served, but it was a grim, bloody, and ambiguous justice, born of the mountain's own savage laws, leaving only the silence and the ghosts.